Hello, and a huge welcome to the 26th video in the series of Research Methodology, titled Methods of Manipulating and Controlling Variables. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. So, to get us started, I want you to think of a researcher as, well, kind of like a movie director. A director doesn't just point a camera at a stage and passively hope for a blockbuster to happen, right? Not at all. They actively manage everything. They guide the actors, they adjust the lighting, they tweak the script, and they perfectly design the set to tell a very specific story. In scientific research, and especially in experimental research, your variables are your actors and your set. If you really want to uncover the true story of how things work in the universe, you have to know exactly how to direct them. You literally can't just let the actors improvise the whole thing and expect to capture a masterpiece.
Which brings us to a really massive question. Honestly, this is pretty much the holy grail of scientific research. How do we actually prove cause and effect? Because, it's one thing to just notice two things happening at the exact same time. We see that all the time. But it is an entirely different beast to prove that one thing actually caused the other. To cross that bridge from mere coincidence to undeniable causation, researchers have to rely on two incredibly powerful tools, and those are manipulation and control. These are essentially these specialized tools we use to strip away all the random coincidences of life and reveal true, rock-solid causal relationships.
All right, so here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll kick things off with Chapter 1, The Art of Manipulation. Then we'll learn how to quiet the background noise in Chapter 2, Mastering Variable Control. After that, we'll sharpen up our tools in Chapter 3, Reliable Measurement and Bias, before finally grounding everything in Chapter 4, Ethics and Real-World Limits. Let's dive right in.
Chapter 1. The Art of Manipulation. It's time to set the stage. Now, to manipulate anything, you first need to know who your actors are. In our production, we have two main stars. First up is the independent variable. This is the presumed cause, the intervention, the actual thing that you, the researcher, change. Our second star is the dependent variable, which is the measured effect or the outcome that you are carefully observing. Let's make this concrete. Imagine you want to know if a wild, hands-on, activity-based teaching method works better than a standard, totally boring lecture. That teaching method, choosing between the lecture or the activity, that's your independent variable. You are the one changing it. The student's academic achievement, which you might measure by their final test score, well, that's your dependent variable. You measure it to see exactly how your star actor performed under those new conditions.
So what do we mean by manipulation? It simply means deliberately changing or varying the independent variable in a research study to observe its effect on a dependent variable. Remember our movie director analogy? This is the director giving explicit, direct cues to the lead actors. You can manipulate things directly, like choosing to apply that new teaching strategy, or you can do it by changing the environmental conditions around the subjects. For instance, you could place one group of students in a perfectly quiet room and another group right next to a loud, chaotic construction site, just to see how the noise impacts their concentration. You are intentionally setting the scene to force a reaction.
Methodology experts Kurlinger and Lee actually put this perfectly. It's really a foundational truth for everything we do in this field. They state that experimental research is powerful because it allows researchers to manipulate independent variables and control extraneous influences in order to test causal relationships. This quote absolutely hits the nail on the head. It highlights exactly why manipulation is the defining feature of powerful experimental research. It is literally the engine that drives the discovery of cause and effect, because without it, well, you were just a passive observer watching the world go by.
But here's the thing. Manipulation isn't just some simple on or off switch. A crucial concept we need to talk about here is variation in treatment levels. Instead of just testing whether a treatment exists or doesn't exist, researchers very often test different amounts, intensities, or durations. Think of it like taking medicine. A doctor doesn't just ask, hey, did you take aspirin? They need to know, did you take 200 milligrams or 500? This reveals what we call the dose-response relationship. So if you're studying the effect of study time on academic achievement, you wouldn't just look at studying versus not studying at all. You might compare groups studying 1 hour, 2 hours, or even 3 hours a day to see exactly how much of that independent variable is actually needed to trigger a meaningful change in the outcome.
And that variation naturally leads us into how we actually design and divide our participant groups. Generally speaking, we split our participants into distinct camps. The experimental group is the one that receives the new treatment or the intervention we're testing. The control group, on the other hand, does not. They get the usual condition, or in some cases, a placebo. Comparing these two groups is ultimately how you prove your treatment actually works.
In medical research, for example, placebos, like a basic sugar pill that looks exactly like the real medicine, are absolutely essential. Why? Because the human brain is so wildly powerful that sometimes a person can literally cure their own headache just through the sheer expectation of getting better. Having a control group helps us separate the true biological effects of the medicine from the pure power of positive thinking.
Of course, returning to our director analogy, you can't just yell action, cross your fingers, and assume your actors followed your instructions perfectly. You have to verify it. And we do this using manipulation checks. A manipulation check is a procedure built into your study to confirm that the participant actually experienced the condition you intended them to. Let's say you're trying to manipulate stress by giving a group a highly difficult math task under intense time pressure. You must check in and ask them to rate their stress level. If your so-called high-pressure group isn't actually feeling stressed at all, well, your manipulation completely failed, and any data you collect is absolutely meaningless. You have to know for sure that your setup worked before you trust the results.
Okay, so your lead actors are hitting their marks perfectly. But what about all that background noise on the set? Welcome to Chapter 2, Mastering Variable Control.
While you are laser-focused on your independent variable, there are almost always uninvited guests trying to crash your study. We call these extraneous and confounding variables. Basically, these are outside factors that can secretly influence your dependent variable and totally distort your findings. Let's go back to our education example. Say you're studying the effect of online learning on student achievement. You really have to watch out for things like the student's internet access, their baseline digital skills, or even the amount of parental support they get at home. If you don't carefully control for those hidden factors, you might look at the data and wrongly conclude that the online learning program alone caused a huge spike in grades. But in reality, the successful students might have just had way better Wi-Fi and parents who helped them with their homework every night. Those uninvited guests can completely ruin the whole scene if you're not paying attention.
Methodology pioneers Campbell and Stanley gave us a golden rule to live by here. Control of rival explanations is essential for establishing internal validity. Now, internal validity is incredibly important. It is essentially your fortress. It's the absolute assurance that the results you're seeing in your dependent variable are truly and entirely due to your treatment and absolutely not due to rival explanations or confounding variables. Why does this matter to you as a consumer of information? Well, understanding internal validity is exactly what helps you spot those terribly flawed news headlines about the latest miracle diet. Because if a study lacks internal validity, that so-called miracle might just be a total coincidence.
So how do we actually fight off these threats and protect our fortress? We have a very specific methodological toolkit with a precise cure for each problem. Let's walk through it. Dealing with completely unknown extraneous variables, your go-to control method is randomization. Now, what if you're worried that participants will get tired or maybe they'll learn the test as they take it multiple times during a study? We call those order effects. The cure for that is counterbalancing, which simply means mixing up the order of the tasks for different people. Next, to fight procedural differences, say where one testing room happens to be nicely air-conditioned while another is sweltering hot, you use standardization, keeping your instructions and environments completely identical across the board. And finally, if you have known differences, like students' prior knowledge of a subject, you use matching to pair similar students evenly across your experimental and control groups. Every threat has a solution.
Let's actually zoom in on randomization for a second, because it truly is the gold standard of research design. Randomization means assigning participants to either the experimental or the control groups purely by chance. Think flipping a coin or using a random number generator. Experts like Shadish, Cook, and Campbell consider random assignment one of the absolute strongest defenses against selection bias. And the reason why is almost like magic. If your groups are large enough, randomization naturally balances out age, intelligence, motivation, and all those completely unknown hidden factors equally across both groups. It completely neutralizes their impact, leaving only your independent variable to shine.
Broadly speaking, we have two main approaches to implementing control: physical and statistical. Physical control is exactly what it sounds like, holding the physical environment constant, putting everyone in the exact same room at the exact same time of day with the exact same lighting. But what happens when physical control is just impossible? You obviously can't force everyone's prior life experiences to be identical. You can't control exactly what they ate for breakfast. That is when we turn to statistical control. When the physical world is just too messy, you measure those differences up front and then use complex math, like analysis of covariance, to statistically neutralize their influence later on during the data analysis phase. It's a brilliant backup plan.
Chapter 3, Reliable Measurement and Bias. We have to make absolutely sure our tools and researchers aren't accidentally ruining the pristine environment we just built.
One of the best, most practical ways to protect your study from disaster is by running a pilot test. Think about it. You don't just shoot a $100 million blockbuster movie on day one. You do a dress rehearsal. Step 1 is conducting a small, preliminary version of your study. Step 2 is using that run to identify flaws. Maybe you realize your questionnaire is way too long and people are getting bored, or your instructions are wildly confusing to the average person. Step 3 is refining your instrument for the main study. Doing this practice run saves you from getting 3 months into a wildly expensive study only to realize your main data collection tool is basically broken.
We also have to control the humans involved, both the participants and the researchers, through a process called blinding. If participants know they are getting a special, highly touted treatment, their expectations will inevitably influence their responses. That's exactly why we use single-blind studies, where the participants are kept totally in the dark about which group they are in. But it goes deeper. To prevent researcher bias, where a researcher might subconsciously or maybe even consciously treat the experimental group just a little bit better, we use double-blind studies. In a double-blind study, neither the participant nor the researcher directly interacting with them knows who is getting the actual treatment and who is getting the placebo. It keeps the data entirely honest.
And that brings us to our final section. Chapter 4, Ethics and Real-World Limits. The messy reality of research.
At the end of the day, we have to remember that we are conducting research on actual human beings, not abstract variables in a petri dish. Because of that, we are firmly bound by the Belmont Report, which outlines 3 absolutely non-negotiable ethical principles. First is respect for persons, which demands informed consent, meaning participants must voluntarily agree to join after understanding the risks. Second is beneficence, meaning researchers must actively minimize harm and maximize benefits. You absolutely cannot ethically manipulate a harmful condition, like purposely causing extreme stress or injury, just to see what happens. And third is justice, which demands fair treatment. In fact, if an educational or medical intervention is known to be incredibly beneficial, it is highly unethical to deny it to the control group forever. In those cases, researchers will use what's called a waitlist control group, where the control group still gets the amazing intervention, just a little bit later on.
And as we wrap up, we must constantly acknowledge the limitations of seeking perfect control. Human behavior is deeply complex, and it is influenced by countless overlapping variables. Researchers are constantly performing a high-wire act here. They are balancing strict, sterile laboratory control against the messy realism of the actual world. If your lab setting is too perfect and too rigid, your findings might not actually apply to everyday, chaotic human life, and that ruins what we call external validity. As a smart consumer of research, you always have to ask yourself, does this highly sterile lab study actually work in the real world? Furthermore, there are simply many things we cannot ethically or practically manipulate in a lab setting, such as a person's experiences of poverty, natural disasters, or trauma. We have to study those in other, more observant ways.
Which leaves us with this final crucial question to ponder today. Where exactly do we draw the line between perfect scientific control and real-world relevance? How much should we manipulate our subjects and environments before our findings just stop applying to everyday life? Think on that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer on methods of manipulating and controlling variables. I really hope this breakdown helped clarify these incredible concepts for you. If you found this valuable, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss out on our future deep dives. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next one.